I want to open by saying that, this slide is not kind of what I've drawn in 2 minutes without any relevance to anything. This is kind of my motivational slide for the talk. And I guess the inspiration for this is a set of surveys I've done over the last 2 years with a bunch of teams here in the States and some other places around how they approach acceptance testing in particular in relatively agile projects. When we put everything together, I was quite surprised with one of the results. And then when I sort of communicated back to the people who participate in the survey, they were quite surprised as well. So I'm hoping that that's going to surprise you and maybe give you some food for thought about where the long-term value of this thing really is. And because I have only 10 minutes, I will shorten the phrase automated functional acceptance tests into tests. So you guys can put things into context. And when I say tests, don't jump at me and say, well, there are manual tests and there are these things and those things. When I say tests for the next 10 minutes, it's automated functional acceptance tests. That's kind of been the focus of my work over the last 5 or 6 years in particular. And I got into this discussion with Tom Gilbert. I should have probably known better than to get into a discussion with a person who's been doing conferences for 30 years. Where at Agile Testing Days 2009, where he said Agile doesn't work because there's no focus on business value and there's no focus on actually delivering things and things like that. And then I said, well, it works for all those reasons, but if you take that stuff out of a process, whatever that process remains can't possibly work. And then he won the discussion by asking, where's the data? So yes, I've spent about 2 years collecting data because I don't like to lose and I'm very insistent on stuff. So as a consultant, I don't get to work with teams over 5 or 6 years. I get engaged with people who kind of suck and get them to suck a bit less and then move on when they're happy to continue working on their own. And I've not really seen the long-term effects of what people can achieve when they do testing properly, again, automated, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of the people who I spoke with and a lot of the complaints online with automated acceptance testing are around maintenance and all these tests are breaking all the time and they cost us too much to maintain and they're very brittle and things like that. And the companies who I talked to that failed utterly with testing have failed because they've not recognized that factor when it was still manageable. And for example, I talked to a team that worked for a French bank where they started refusing changes to software because a 10-minute change to the code would result in a week of test maintenance. And from that perspective, tests became an impediment to change, not a facilitator. And on the other hand, I talked to a team that has 100,000 tests in fitness and very happily release every week and keep that under control and maintain that. And the more we were talking about problems that people had and solutions people had for these things, the more I realized that all these problems around really maintainability of tests and brittleness and the fact that people complain about having too many tests and things like that and that they're hard to manage are not problems with the test. They're symptoms of a much larger problem where really the problem is in the way people approach software. And a lot of these same problems appear in software development and in a couple of cases even in business. And what really started me thinking about these things is people who got big benefits out of acceptance testing, automated acceptance testing, invested heavily in maintaining their tests, cleaning them up, and most people talked about regression testing as the big benefit of it long term. And in most literature, kind of regression testing is presented as the big benefit long term. But kind of Capers-Jones, whether you choose to believe him or not, has the statistics that the effectiveness of regression testing is around 23%, which is kind of, out of all the bugs that anybody's ever going to catch in any way, 23% of them are going to be caught by regression tests. And Brian Murray published a paper in 2003 where he said, kind of, if I remember the figures correctly, 60% of the bugs he catches, 60% of the problems he catches by writing and running the test for the first time. 20% is kind of running the test subsequently, and 10% is other means. And kind of 20% is not good enough to justify the investment these people made in their testing systems. But kind of, they were all getting some benefits that were much higher than regression testing. And really the first time I've heard of this was watching Rick Mugridge doing a video called Doubling the Value of Automated Tests in 2006 at the Google Tech Talk, Google Test Automation Conference. And he said that basically, if you watch the video, he talks about how they've managed to clean up their tests so much that in this New Zealand airline, customer service representatives use the tests to answer customer support calls. And this was kind of strange from that perspective. And he quotes the director of that New Zealand airline saying that tests became a valuable business resource, which is kind of quite interesting because most teams I work with and most teams I talk with have a problem of business people not caring at all about anything that happens in testing. And here we have the director of an airline saying, well, tests are a valuable business resource. And I didn't fully understand that at that point, and it took me a couple of years to actually start talking to many other people. And for example, Lisa Crispin said that she works for this kind of pension fund on one end and an investment fund on the other end. And she said that kind of they often get asked, well, you know, this person got charged too much or we paid too little and things like that. So they have to prove whether the amount was correct. And she said, well, you know, we proved that by pulling out an automated test, putting the details of that customer in the test, pressing test, and then, you know, the figure that comes out is the figure that we trust this to be the right figure that should have been deducted from the account. And then we can answer that. And I talked to, for example, Channing Walton, who worked for a big investment bank here, and their problem with test maintenance at some point got them to rethink why their tests are so complex. And they realized that their tests are so complex not because of the way that they were writing tests, but because, you know, 5 different departments in this bank were doing the same process without talking to each other in slightly different ways, and redundant checks and things like that. And the test they wrote was the first time that they actually put the whole business process together in a single piece of whatever, electronic document. And as a result of that, they went back to kind of the business and said, this doesn't make sense. And he says that kind of as a result of that, the business process was simplified, and they were able to then kind of simplify the test as well. And the guys at the Sierra team in BNP Paribas, so this is a kind of fantastic case study for the whole approach, because they claimed they had no bugs in production for 5 years, and they release every 2 weeks a bond static data kind of consolidation system for the whole bank. And because they consolidate data about financial instruments, they often get asked to prove where some figures are coming from, where, you know, somebody in Hong Kong is going to wake up and see on the national television that something is 7, and his system is telling him that that's 5. And then they often get called to kind of support their figures. And I said, you know, these guys claimed that they had no bugs in production for over 5 years. So their figures are correct, but they were still having to prove them very, very often. And Andrew Jackman, who I talked to there, says that kind of in order to manage their tests easier, they were cleaning up their tests, they were making them easier to maintain, and then at some point the tests became so clean that whenever anybody asks them where some figure is coming from, they just send them a test result. And that's often reasonable documentation to explain how these figures are calculated. And kind of the best story I heard absolutely about in the survey is from a company called Iowa Student Loan that, yes, surprise, surprise, based in Iowa and does loans to students. So what they do is at the start, what they used to do is at the start of the year, they had a bond sale, and then they took the money from the bonds and issued them as loans to students, and in 2008 their bond sale fell through. Basically no money to operate. Most of their competitors, similar situation. And what happened then is their business users were looking at tests to estimate the impact of proposed business model changes and to determine what is the best business model change so that they can start operating again. And they were able to kind of replace the core of their system very effectively and go live in about a month and a half. And Tim Anderson, who was the technical lead of that project, when I spoke to him, he says that if they didn't have the tests there, first of all, this would have been a much longer discussion, and it would have been much more difficult to actually figure out what business model change would impact the system the least. And second, even if they had the decision and they didn't have the tests, they would have to throw the whole thing out and basically rewrite it from scratch, because that would be less risky. So kind of, this is where it really struck me that these people don't have tests anymore. Because kind of you don't use tests to support customers when they call you. You don't use tests to prove that your figures are correct. You don't use tests to simplify your business process, and you don't use tests to estimate the impact of business model changes. I think what people would like to use for these things is documentation. And when I say would like to use, that's because in most businesses I worked with, there's absolutely no reliable documentation whatsoever. I don't know how many times I've joined the project where somebody gives me like a book and says, this is what our system does, or this is what our business processes are, but it's not entirely correct. And what all these teams have done that have succeeded with acceptance testing long term, they've cleaned up their tests to be easy to maintain. And as a result of that, their tests became reasonable documentation. Because the funny thing about this is kind of, and we've known about this for what, almost 10 years now from domain-driven design. Eric Evans said that the most useful software models are the models that are aligned with the business concepts, business models, where then as a result, if the concepts, if the relationships, if the ideas expressed in software are aligned with the way that business people think about these same things, then a small change in the business side is going to be reflected by a small change in software. And kind of that's going to be a symmetric change, where a lot of the teams that failed with acceptance testing, they describe the tests as click, 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 CSS, 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 DOM, XPath, DOM. Where kind of that's everything but the language and relationships and the concepts of the business. So in order to achieve kind of easier change in their tests, these people had to align their tests with the business models, relationships, entities, kind of the business people have in their heads. And as a result of that, kind of their tests really became the documentation for the business process. And these tests are automated, which means that as soon as there's a problem in the pipeline, you can look at it as a regression bug, but you can also look at it from the perspective of my documentation no longer describes my software. And then it becomes very, very easy to update this documentation. And I think my assumption is that kind of going forward, we can get to that position much quicker if we don't aim to write tests, if we aim to document our business processes and automate that documentation. And that's going to give us a lot more than just testing, because then that becomes a valuable business resource, and we'll get business people keen to get involved, and we'll get kind of business people to appreciate what this thing is. So this is why kind of I think we should move from regression testing to thinking about documentation, and that's kind of my pitch.